All right, David, thanks for taking some time out of your Monday and talking about trawl bycatch.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks a lot for having me on here. It's become a bigger and bigger deal. 5 years ago, a lot of people hadn't heard about it, but now you hear about it all the time.
Yeah. I think a good place to start is to kind of talk about the difference. Like, it's not anti-commercial fishing. That's not even close. When people think about net fishing for salmon, they think of purse seining, but bottom trawling is different than trolling, obviously, and then way different than purse seining too. The size of the net is an order of magnitude larger. So maybe give a brief illustration or difference between the types of commercial fishing.
Yeah, so you hit on a super important point. A lot of people have tried to take on trawl in the past, but it's usually an ecological organization that's maybe looking at banning all fishing altogether, or they don't like any nets. But what's really been different about this is it's been really driven by commercial fishermen themselves. So there's kind of this whistleblower component of, hey, we acknowledge that we kill fish for a living. We make money off the resource. We make money off the ocean. We fish ourselves. But there's this one elephant in the room of trawl that is just not sustainable. Everybody wants to make money, but we want to make money tomorrow, and we want to have our kids make money. And fishermen in Alaska don't think trawl is going to allow that. Yeah, and so getting into it really is the magnitude and the size of trawl, and also how it fishes. So when we typically think of a fisherman, we think of, at a very basic level, one hook, one fishing line is fishing for one fish, and that can catch too many fish too. But trawl is just the complete opposite of that. So the way the trawl net is designed for efficiency, and it just strains the water. So it's not, obviously, a captain wants to target one fish because that's more efficient, but anything that this net passes by, it catches, and the nets will have about an inch and a half wide mesh. So if something's bigger than an inch and a half, it goes in the net and it comes up on the boat, and it usually gets crushed by the weight of the other fish in the process. So not much survives. And a big net, they say, will hold about four 747s, plus the Eiffel Tower inside. The foot rope, the leading edge of it on a big trawl net's about a quarter mile wide. So you think of that dragging across the seafloor, you're cutting this quarter mile wide swath every time the net gets towed.
Mhm. And, fishing up here in Southeast Alaska during July and August, you'll see seiners who are looking for jumpers as an indication there's some fish there to set the net. And if you get a water haul, it's very disappointing and the crew's upset. But with the trawler, it's just indiscriminate catching, and it's just a matter of getting as much and of everything as possible. So if you are a purse seining or something like that, you're getting some bycatch, like if a whale gets in the net, you are in trouble. You drop the net, the whale swims out. If you happen to get a steelhead, there might be a chance that it could be released and be okay. But if you do end up catching something that you're not intending to catch, that's bycatch. And in the trawl setting, there's no possibility of survival.
Essentially, yeah. So NOAA Fisheries manages most of trawl, and they do assign survival rates to different species of fish. So I think, well, in some instances, they say that 50% of the halibut will survive. That's been pretty hotly contested. But they say like 100% of the crab die, 100% of the salmon die if they get in nets. A few years ago, they had, I think, 9 orca whales. They said one of those survived, but it's not like they follow this orca whale after it's released from the net. It was a mammal getting towed around for how long underwater. So there's been a lot of critiques of those survival numbers or assumed survival numbers. And since trawl catches so much fish and so much bycatch, it's not like we're dealing with one salmon at a time or one crab at a time. We're talking, hundreds of millions of tons, essentially, hundreds of tons.
Mhm. So statistics can make this a little bit misleading. I know you've posted about this on the Facebook group a lot. There's a difference between a very small percentage of their bycatch being king salmon or something that's not intended halibut. But when you're catching tons and tons and tons of fish, the number of fish ends up being the critical number, because especially if you have areas of the state that aren't allowed to keep king salmon or the fishery is shut down, you have substantial amounts of king salmon that are being caught as bycatch, and that's kind of allowed and kind of built into their allowances.
For sure. So there's definitely two ways to look at trawl bycatch numbers, and trawl prefers to look at it as a percentage of the total, but the average Alaskan or the average fisherman can kind of see through that and they'll look at it as individual fish. So an example of that is trawl catches around 3 billion pounds of pollock per year, and they'll advertise or brag essentially about a 1 to 2% bycatch rate. But 1 to 2% of 3.2 billion pounds is, 32 to 64 million pounds of wasted fish. So if you wrap up all the trawl numbers together, there's some different areas and some different types, but NOAA has told us they've averaged 141 million pounds of trawl bycatch per year, every year for the last 10 years. So you're looking at 1.4 billion pounds of waste in a decade, or about 16,000 pounds of waste per hour, every hour for 10 years straight. And that's just what comes up in the nets. It doesn't count anything that gets mowed over on the seafloor, or that falls out, or the observer misses it. There's all these sidebars to it. That's just what's been verified on deck.
Mhm. And that's the primary target is pollock, which is made into a whole bunch of different things. It's not like a nice filleted pollock that you get at a real seafood restaurant. It's more of the fast food type stuff, and it's also used in imitation crab and fertilizer and things like that. So pollock is the main thing. A big concerning bycatch would be halibut. But can you give me some numbers on the king salmon, especially as that is a dwindling resource, especially in the Yukon, Kuskokwim areas?
Yeah, so there's a couple main categories. There's pollock trawl gets the most amount of fish by pound, so they're about 3 billion pounds. But then there's also a dedicated bottom trawl fleet that gets pushing another 1 billion pounds. And the dedicated bottom trawl fleet has big issues with halibut bycatch, crab bycatch. They get some salmon bycatch, but pollock's big one is like salmon and herring. So I believe last year they had about 43,000 individual king salmon recorded. This year, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but they've exceeded their herring bycatch limit in Bering Sea. That's a pretty sore subject. It's a prohibited species out there, so it's supposed to be a hard cap that shuts down the fishery tomorrow, essentially, if you hit it. But they're now at 117% of their herring bycatch limit. So that'll probably come up in the meetings this year.
And herring is super important because that's a feeder fish for others. So we're not taking herring home and eating it, but that's what king salmon are eating. That's what a lot of these other fish are using to sustain. And so herring are extremely important in the food cycle.
For sure. And that really opens up the bigger picture question on all of this is that if you start looking at food webs, especially in the Bering Sea, the pollock is actually at the very center of it. So pollock is a huge food fish, a huge forage fish. At all life cycles, we think of maybe a 3 pound pollock. It's too big for a king salmon to eat, but they all start out as eggs, and they come through these different sizes where everything eats pollock. So the big question, besides just that we catch, 44,000 pounds or 44,000 kings and waste them, is how much food did we take out of the middle of the Bering Sea via this pollock extraction? And they talk about seabirds starving to death, crabs starving to death, salmon starving to death, gray whales starving to death, sea lions, spur seals, all these things which all depend on pollock in the Bering Sea are all starving to death. And because the spreadsheet for pollock doesn't have the words forage fish on it, NOAA looks at that and essentially says, oh, well, no, none of these things can be intertwined because pollock isn't a forage fish. But that's really just a notation error, essentially. So that's become under scrutiny too.
Mhm. The ecological damage is also something to look at. Alaska is a massive resource extraction economy. We get a lot of our state, or most of our state money comes from oil. But if you go up to the Haul Road, you see the pipeline, you see the infrastructure, you see the caribou, and think, okay, this is where we're at. This is how much disruption has occurred. You can kind of get an idea and a scope and scale of it here in Southeast Alaska with the logging. You could think, okay, this is where we're at. This has been logged. This is freshly cut logged. You're still going to find deer around there. As far as like bycatch with logging doesn't happen. I don't know. There are probably some squirrels that died maybe during the logging process, but you can see the ecosystem, the damage that was done and how it recovers. But the damage to the bottom of the ocean is something we don't see and isn't really being mentioned a whole lot. And the sustainability long term, like it doesn't grow back in the same way that maybe a forest can. And then obviously it's not a surgical procedure like the North Slope drilling.
Yeah, and so I think oil is a great analogy for this, or a great comparison, I guess, especially for Alaskans. So if you start looking at trawl habitat impact numbers, so they say the biggest trawlers in the Bering Sea will mow down essentially or drag about 6 square miles of seafloor per boat per day. And they fish most of the year. So if you start adding up all those numbers, you come up with like 48,000 square miles per year of impacted seafloor, which it's hard to quantify that number. But for comparison, they say that the Willow North Slope project, which has been hotly contested across the nation, will have an impact of about zero point 0.8 square miles of land this year. And we recently looked at the Florida Keys Marine Sanctuary as this massive, like keystone example of habitat protection. That's about 3,800 square miles. So we're talking 10 times or more every year being drug. And at the start of this, we talked about how trawlers can't necessarily see a jumper. They can look on their fish finder and figure out where they want to tow, but what they do is they target the most productive areas of the ocean. So any fisherman knows that every square foot of the ocean isn't built equally. We want to fish on the ledges or the mounds or the humps or where the current upwells. And so that is what the trawlers target too. So they'll say that, hey, yeah, maybe we tow 48,000 square miles per year, but a lot of times we overlap ourselves. We tow the same 48,000. But what they're doing is they're fishing the most productive geographic areas of the ocean over and over and over, dragging it. And yeah, they don't touch every square inch, but the parts they aren't touching are the parts where the fish don't live anyways. So
Mhm. Yeah, I can't remember where I read it or heard it, which is a bad citation, but some of these areas that are very, very productive identified as like halibut nursery areas. And so a trawler can go into an area that's known to be a halibut nursery and very important to halibut, but they can fish for pollock. And so because we're not targeting halibut, that's their loop around to be able to fish this area, which is absolutely wild and just shows the depth of the political power that the trawling lobby has if they're able to get those sort of, I don't know, if they're able to do that sort of thing, just shows just how entrenched they are with the politicians.
for sure, and that's a great example. So like coming back to, we were just saying that pollock not being considered a forage fish by fish regulators is essentially a bookkeeping error. Everybody else looks at it and they say, of course they eat pollock, but that's not how the legal definition of pollock goes. So they say can't be related. And the same thing happens in those halibut nurseries. So everybody knows that trawling through a halibut nursery would be terrible, but it gets caught up in between these regulatory bodies where, since they aren't intentionally targeting halibut there for sale, the regulators say, oh, we can't regulate that because they're not targeting it. It's just an accident. But you and I and any fisherman in Alaska can come in and say that's not common sense, and we're going to lose the resource and we're going to lose the habitat if we do that. And that's why all this has been so driven by fishermen themselves and this whistleblower component of like, no, we're not going to allow this to happen, because it's crushing the future of Alaska and the future of the Alaska's fisheries.
Mm. One of the most, I guess, sad things about this is not unprecedented. We have a great example on the East Coast with the cod fishery of what happens when you have this short term scope of things, or when you're just looking short term with the money now and just taking care of business. The cod fishery on the East Coast has essentially collapsed. There's a great book called Cod by Mark Kurlansky that details that, and how the thought was cod are going to be able to just replenish indefinitely, and that obviously hasn't happened. So we have an example in the United States to look at what happens if the trawl fleet is allowed to do what it does, and yet it doesn't seem like we are heeding that warning.
Yeah, and that comes back to kind of a bigger thing. So a lot of the trawl fleet in Alaska is this factory trawl model where the boat's not from here, the crew's not from here, the captain's not from here, the owners of the trawl boats often aren't from here. And so essentially what we have is this boat gets sent out. It can be sent out anywhere in the world, and the crew just flies to meet it. So the crew doesn't really care where the boat fishes, and the owner doesn't care where it fishes as long as it's legal. And so there's no investment in protecting our own backyard. So if you and we looked at the waters outside of Homer or the waters at Southeast, if we screw those up, we're stuck with it. We're not leaving, we're not going into the Arctic to fish for krill or something, we have to protect our own backyard. But that hasn't been the scenario for trawl. So you see these examples of trawlers that are now fishing in the Bering Sea, which had started on the East Coast. They'd participated in that Grand Banks cod trawl fishery. They'd crashed it, or they'd been part of the crash, but they're big floating hotels, so they don't care. The same company still owns them, the same crew still runs them, but they moved it, 6,000 miles up to Alaska, and they still profit off the same technique, except now they've essentially become stronger from a legal standpoint, or working within the federal management councils. They've been through a crash. They know what the opposition is going to be, and they can kind of safeguard themselves and say, oh, well, maybe this will happen this time, or we're so much better than we were in the 90s. But all the signs are still there, and the habitat's being lost. And that's something we can never recover from, or it might take 500 years.
Mhm. So what is the local there is a local economic input. Are we talking more like the fish processing areas? Because there is an element of jobs that's part of the economies, and so of course it's not a matter of, hey, just we don't want fellow Alaskans to have to just find another job. But as far as like short-term impact versus long-term impact, why would it be better to transition away from trawl into more sustainable practices?
For sure. So it's kind of like clear cutting a forest in a way. You could say that, clear cutting a forest might be great for jobs right now, but then the forest is gone for the next 50 years or however long it takes to regrow. So that's the analogy here with trawl is, yeah, it is creating jobs and there is a tax base from it. But when it's gone, it's really gone. And the biggest concern is that it's taking the habitat and the other species with it. Yeah. But there are two forms of trawler essentially. One is the factory trawler. They call it a catcher processor in the legal documents, catches and processes in the same boat. And all of those fishing in Alaska right now are home ported in Seattle. So it behooves them to bring as much fuel as they can, bring as much food as they can. A lot of times they'll hire locally from out of state. And they're just here to extract. A lot of the fish they catch never touches ground in Alaska. Their preferred method to transport it is to offload it essentially at sea, to pull into a cove, put it on a tramper. A lot of that goes to China or Asia without ever touching ground in Alaska. And we do get a little 3.5% landing tax on it, but the pollock isn't worth very much. It's like 9 cents a pound. So I think in the example specifically of pollock, they say that tax base brings about $21 million per year into the state of Alaska, which is a road or a bridge. It's not in, when you look at the Alaska budget, it's just this, not an insignificant fraction, but it's a fraction.
Mhm.
Then the other style are those typically smaller catcher vessels. They don't have the ability to process on board the boat, so they're forced to bring the fish back to land in Alaska, land it, and then at the processing, reshipping happens. So those are a little bit better from a financial perspective, but they're still dragging bottom, and taking forage fish out of the center of the food web.
Mhm. Let's talk a little bit more about the political learnings that they have or the power that they have. What is it you mentioned in the podcast on Outdoor Life about the Magnuson-Stevens Act and the unintended consequences of that? That put limited state governance and allowed these conflicts of interest to become pervasive in the management. So, how was that act that was supposed to kind of help out with fisheries management? How is it being kind of used right now to protect interests?
Yeah, so the prior to the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which I think was in 1976, the USA didn't have any control over its waters essentially. So Russian boats or Chinese or Japanese boats could come and fish within sight of land in Alaska. And so they, analogous to what Washington's doing to us now, they could come from a foreign place, fish in Alaska, tear up our backyard, and all the profits would go somewhere else where you get stuck with the open pit essentially. And so the Magnuson-Stevens Act realized that this was a problem. It was bad for Alaska. The Stevens in the Magnuson-Stevens Act is Ted Stevens, the Alaska senator. And so they created this law that said no foreign non-USA vessels could fish within 200 miles of any USA coastline. And that was great. But when they did that, then they had to come up with a way to regulate all the USA vessels that would be fishing there. And so they set up these 8 regional councils. In Alaska, we work under the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. It's abbreviated NPFMC. And on that are 11 voting members. Alaska chooses 6 of them. But anyways, the back to your question, what the big problem there was that when Washington D.C. created these councils in faraway places like Alaska, they wanted fishermen to be able to regulate fishermen. So they wanted the people that were actively out on the fishing grounds to come back in the fall or whenever it may be and say, I saw this year. We have to create this regulation to fix it to preserve fish. And so, in order to do that, they had to exclude the standard conflict of interest regulations, which every other government body has. They had to say, we know that you might be voting in favor of yourself because you're a fisherman voting on fish, and we acknowledge that and we're going to allow it. But they probably didn't imagine that what that would be twisted into is now we have like CEOs, lawyers, lobbyists, current employees of trawl corporations are on this NPFMC voting on regulations to regulate trawl. And NPFMC seats are chosen by state governors from Alaska, Oregon, Washington. And so then you get into this campaign contribution issue of maybe the trawl corporation says, hey, Governor Dunleavy, I'll give you $100,000 for your campaign and do with it what you will. But, suddenly that translates into, well, yeah, we'll make your vice president one of these voting people on the NPFMC to regulate trawl. And no other fishery can compete with that essentially because of the volume of money.
Mm. Yeah, the other industries you see a lot of charter fishermen versus commercial, like here in Southeast Alaska, and so there's that can be contentious, that can be debated, but there usually is maybe some sort of consensus or some sort of agreement or some sort of maybe middle ground. But with the trawl, it's just so unbelievably one-sided, and it's that corporate money is just something that doesn't exist in a lot of these smaller individually owned boats versus individually owned charter operations. The trawl is just it's so the tentacles are so wide and there's so much money involved. It's pretty daunting. What can we do about it? Like, is there eh, what can we do?
The so the For Alaskans, the biggest linchpin of all of this. So we talked about how this regional council had been created to regulate trawl. It's called the NPFMC. There's 11 voting members on it, and 6 of those voting members are chosen by the Alaska governor. And those seats last, or those appointments last for 3 years at a time. So every 3 years, essentially, we get a new NPFMC, and they're staggered, but a single governor and a single 4-year term would have the opportunity to recreate the Alaska side of the NPFMC. And since we get to choose 6 of the 11 voting members on there, Alaska has this guaranteed majority. So essentially, whatever the Alaska governor, whatever direction he or she wants the state to go in with trawl, they have been deeded all this ability via their choices in the NPFMC. And so, we've had feedback from previous governors that essentially said we didn't understand that we could do that. Somebody brought us this paperwork and said, we like these guys for fishing, sign it. But that's, the voters essentially were sloppy and allowed governors to do that. And the governors were sloppy and they should have looked harder. But now in this 2026 election, Alaska Governor Dunleavy is termed out. He can't run for reelection. So all these governor candidates, no matter what side you're on, need to know that this is a huge priority. And we'd like to ask them, who exactly are you going to put on the NPFMC? You're not going to put a trawl employee on there again, or at least not 6 of them. And so that's a huge question for Alaska voters to ask. When Mary Peltola ran, and she brought a lot of awareness to it because she'd worked on it before Don Young had even died. And so then we kind of got into this competition of like, Mary says she's going to do a better job at trawl than her competitor is. And they said, no, I'm going to do a better job than Mary. And so I think Alaskans really win when political figures take this on, when they see that they can get votes from it and start trying to outdo each other. That's when Alaskans start to make progress on it.
Mhm. What is it? Something like 74% of Alaskans are against the trawl industry, which is an overwhelming majority. Typically, people are excited about like a 56 or a 57, but 74% of Alaskans are against. Is it against trawling or want to ban trawling?
I can't quite remember how the question was posed, but I think it was that they didn't want any trawling within 200 miles of Alaska. So that would essentially come down to a ban. And, one of the most interesting things to me on that poll is that, and this is where we come back to fishermen, fishermen concede that this is unsustainable, is typically trawling gets grouped into like this ecological issue. So you'll see Greenpeace talk about it, or Sea Shepherd, or whatever it may be. And that tends to be a Democratic issue. But in Alaska and in that poll, the Republican side of things were actually more opposed to it than the Democrat side was. So that's this huge unifying issue, and now we've had Nick Begich talk about it, making these pledges to take it on from the Republican side. So it's really cool that it's bipartisan or beyond that, maybe even a Republican led at this point.
Mhm. That's the interesting thing about Alaska is everything is so much closer. So you can be a non-hunter in a town where you know hunters, and so you're not an antagonistic anti-hunter. It's just I don't want to hunt. I think it's cruel. I want to be a vegetarian or a vegan, but I know people who are hunters, and so I'm not going to be antagonistic. You can do your thing. I can do my thing. It's so much more close here. You know someone in the community who disagrees with you politically, but you understand how important it is in these Alaskan communities to have some resource extraction, some tourism, something like that there. So it's a lot more, you would think, reasonable because it's not some abstract idea. You mentioned like the Greenpeace and some of those organizations. It's their ways of getting things done tend to be a little bit more aggressive than for a lot of people's stomach.
Yeah, for sure. I think Alaskans are really good at cutting through that kind of bipartisanship fog and seeing that this is a common sense regulation. This is where I want the government in my life, or this is where I don't want the government in my life. And overall, we're probably one less government around, but this is a step where, hey, this is a common sense deal. This is sustainability. In order for us to make money, we have to have this habitat intact. So we need a bigger step in to bring common sense back into this regulation.
Mhm. So, did you start the Stop Alaskan Trawler Bycatch public group?
No, a friend of mine, Jody Mason, out of Whittier and Anchorage, had originally, and we all kind of dogpiled in there. I had a biology background, and I'd been like president of the charter association in the past. So I'd looked at these numbers, and we all roll our eyes and say, "Oh my God, how does Straw get away with this?" But 20 years ago, there was just enough halibut specifically was what brought it on our radar. There was enough halibut around that the charter allocation could be filled with no problem. People were fishing 7 days a week. The limit was two halibut per person, and so nobody liked it. But it also wasn't politically really worth sticking your neck out.
Hmm.
But as those restrictions have become tighter and tighter, now this hypocrisy of maybe trawl takes 3 or 4 times as much halibut as the charter anglers do, and they dump it. So then it becomes where something has to be done. We're bending as far as we can, and something is going to have to break. And same deal with like salmon on the Yukon River. When subsistence for that got shut down, that just changes the whole picture of things.
Mhm. What's your full-time job?
So I do charters in Homer. I'd gone to school and did biology and secondary ed as my degree. So high school biology teacher was my training. But yeah, I've got 20 plus years of fishing being my only source of income.
Mhm. So did you feel that this was like a calling? Were you reluctant? Because some people just love the limelight or love the power or love just talking trash. So what was it about this that you wanted to really go full in and really post these things? When I followed the group and there's 47.7 thousand members, and there's always every couple days there's something that you've researched, that you've read about, that you're posting and sharing. Not everybody gets that deep into it. They just kind of complain and don't really do anything about it. So was this something you were looking for, or did you just feel responsible?
Uh, I still wish I wasn't this far into it. The No, so I think my friends always ask me, like I'm trying to be pretty non-controversial in general. I won't take up a political thing in a group ever, but this is different, I think, because it has kind of this schoolyard bully component to it.
Mm,
So we get that, it comes up with longliners and charter fishermen all the time that, charters want more halibut, longliners want more halibut. And we can deal with that because they're, like you said, our neighbors in this community. They built their lives around this resource, on and on, and we can deal with that. And we feel like we have an equal stake when we go to the regulators or when we talk to politicians that there's not nobody's throwing around millions of dollars in the background to create these regs that don't make sense. It's just whoever wins wins, and that's what we have to deal with. But That's not the case with trawl. So when you start to look at, government employees that had left these major regulatory bodies and gone straight into a trawl position, there's this question of, well, had that been promised to them while they were still, voting on the government side of things, or how much money do they make? And it's just an attack on common sense, essentially. So that does keep me going. And the one thing that a lot of people don't realize is I haven't trawled myself, but what's really fed that page and kept it going is that I'll get all these messages from former trawlers, or sometimes
Mhm.
even current employees that are fed up with the hypocrisy of it too, where they want to be in a different industry because they see it as not sustainable. And so that's what's kind of cooking in the background and keeping all these things going, is even the people that profit from it themselves oftentimes have this turning point at some point in their life of, oh my God, we can't do this anymore, like, but now we can't stop it. The beast is so big and so powerful. So,
Mhm. Yeah, one of the last post looks like that I've seen here. It sometimes it organizes it either by last post. Sometimes it's most relevant. I don't know if Facebook keeps switching stuff up, but the trawl caught seals, humpback whale tallies. There's 5 of them between 2014 and 2021. Dolphins, stellar sea lion, bearded seals, fin whale, and that's just the reported stuff. And then scroll down a little bit more about the midwater trawl. That's kind of their reasoning of, well, we don't go to the bottom, it's midwater, and so we're not causing an ecological disaster because we're midwater, but they're catching hundreds of sea stars. So it just kind of shows, well, hold on a second here. If you're going, if you're midwater and you're staying off the bottom, how you catching sea stars?
for sure. And so a lot of people will remember I think in about 2021, they talked about this huge crab crash in the Bering Sea. The red king crab and the Elio crab snow crab had both crashed. And so that came up all these questions with the regulatory agency of, oh my God, how could this have happened? Is it climate change? Is it fishing? What could it be? But from that came out this kind of, I can't say that it was hidden, but they'd had this info from about 5 years previous, where the trawl captains on these midwater trawlers had been asked to make estimates about how often their net was on the seafloor. And their answer was, depending on the boat and the fishery, they said, well, 40 to 100% of the time, we're dragging our net on bottom. And so this really changes things, because it's technically not illegal, we found out later, to have a mid-water net on the bottom. But the place that comes to a head is that when NOAA Fisheries looks at like essential fish habitat and protected areas, they say if a midwater trawler has trawled through it, that essentially they make the assumption that no net has interfered with the coral or whatever this unique habitat was. They say, oh, that's been untouched for 5,000 years. It must be great fish habitat. But then the midwater trawlers drag their nets all over bottom. But there again, it's just this bookkeeping error or intentional omission, is my take. And that's what keeps my fire burning on the hypocrisy of all this. Is
Mhm.
so they have, for instance, a crab protection area in the Bering Sea where bottom trawl has been banned, of course, to protect the crab. But midwater trawls dragging through bottom in this crab protected crab sanctuary isn't banned, and they'll spend millions of dollars and do lawsuits to keep the regulations this way. But for a fisherman or for an Alaskan, it just doesn't make sense. So my take is that we can't keep operating that way.
Mhm. The king salmon thing is pretty worrisome because populations across the state are dwindling. So these the extra bycatch that they're getting is worrisome. Can you talk a little bit about the cap that they have? So as long as they don't reach the cap of these certain, is it poundage or number of fish, then they're okay. They are incentivized essentially to catch up to their cap.
For sure. So this analogy with that I've used in the past is, it's like, say that the Fish and Game says we have all these duck hunters going out each year, and occasionally an eagle might get hit by like a stray shot. And we know that we never want duck hunters to target eagles or anything besides ducks, but we also maybe don't want to throw guys in jail immediately because they accidentally killed the wrong bird with a shotgun. And so they would maybe set aside this cap of like, hey, we acknowledge that 25 eagles per year are going to be accidentally killed by duck hunters. As long as they don't go over that, nobody gets thrown in jail, nobody gets in trouble. And it's just an acknowledgement that this could be a cost of doing business. And so trawl gets the same thing with what's specifically called prohibited species. So halibut, king salmon, crab, herring in the Bering Sea are all these prohibited species. And Fish and Game, or the regulatory bodies, have said, okay, we don't want you guys to target these, but we also don't want you getting thrown in jail or having your season shut down either every time you catch king salmon. So we're going to give you these set aside allotments. And so, an example of king salmon specifically, statewide, they can get, I think, 77,500 king salmon, about 9 million pounds of halibut, or I don't know what the crab is, but 500,000 of a species of crab. And, and that was well intended at the start. But what we found, coming back to what you'd said, is that we see these trawl fleets, instead of doing everything they can to avoid this king salmon, they start looking at paperwork at the end of the year and saying, wow, we really want to fish for pollock where there's a bunch of king salmon. We know we shouldn't be there, but we've only got, 20,000 out of the 77,000 king salmon we can catch. So let's go do it. And business wise and regulatory wise, that is legal. But as an analogy, that would be the same as these duck hunters saying, there's 3 days left in the duck season. Nobody shot any of these 25 eagles. Let's go shoot 24 of them because it's legal. That's not the intent of the regulation. And that, there again, that's what builds up my personal fire and keeps me going, is when we have these well-intended regulations, which are just being twisted and kind of bastardized
Mhm.
to support this fleet.
So what can people do? Where can they sign up? Obviously, follow the group on Facebook, but are there other ways that people can get in contact or set some positive things in motion?
Yeah, so the Facebook group is this Stop Alaskan Trawler Bycatch. It's mostly fishermen and mostly Alaska, so there's no regulation on where the conversation in there might go. It turns into a fist fight sometimes, but we try and keep it mostly constructive. But there are, the AMCC, Alaska Marine Conservation Coalition, has done good work on this. Salmon State's taken it on. Oceania's taken it on. So we like to see money going. If you're looking to donate, it's pretty cool to have some money go into those places. But we also shy away from, like we said before, these international, like Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd. We don't necessarily align with them because there's this concern that they would want to come into Alaska and shut down all fishing, or
Mhm.
paint with too broad of a brush. But I think everybody involved believes that there can be sustainable fishing forever, and that's everybody's goal, is to take these fish, but leave the habitat and leave the brood stock there.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for taking some time out of your Monday. Really appreciate it. Great information, but also horrible information. I gotta clarify that there. Thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Hopefully talk again.